A cold wind whispered through the village that night, carrying with it the echoes of unspoken secrets and unseen fate. In a modest home on the outskirts, a girl toiled beneath the weight of a life she never chose. The world around her moved forward, but she remained trapped in a cycle of endless labor, silent endurance, and the aching memory of a love lost too soon. Yet, deep within the kingdom, change was stirring. A prince, long absent, was returning, a prince whose mere presence could alter destinies. Whispers filled the air, rumors of a choice that would decide the future of the land and the hearts within it. For some, this was a chance at power. For others, a desperate fight for recognition. But for one girl, it was something far more dangerous, a test of resilience, a battle between the past and the future, and a truth that not even she was ready to face. As the sun dipped below the horizon and the village held its breath, fate's hand reached forward, ready to pull the strings. But whose story would it weave? And at what cost? Once upon a time, in a small house on the edge of the village, lived a girl named Mary. Her life began in sadness, as her mother passed away when Mary was very young due to a severe illness. Mary's father, John, was a kind man who worked hard on his farm. After his wife's death, John remarried a woman named Grace. Grace had a daughter named Ruth, who was nearly the same age as Mary. At first, Grace seemed kind and thoughtful, offering comfort to Mary during the loss of her mother. However, as Ruth grew older, things changed. Grace began focusing more on her own daughter, Ruth, leaving Mary feeling neglected and lonely. Mary missed her mother's loving hugs and the laughter they once shared. Mary's days were filled with hard work. She fetched water, cared for the chickens, and helped her father with farming from dawn until dusk. As the years passed, Mary found solace in Mrs. Benson's companionship. Mrs. Benson, a caring widow who lived nearby, had faced her own challenges and losses. She took Mary under her wing, providing advice and support during the difficult times at home. Far away from the village, David, the prince of the kingdom, had been studying in distant lands. David was known for his kind heart and wisdom, despite his young age. Villagers often whispered about his return, speculating that he would choose a bride from among the village girls, as tradition dictated. When the time drew near for David's return, the village was abuzz with excitement and nervous anticipation. Mr. Okoro, the king's trusted aide, was given the responsibility of selecting 6 girls to meet the prince upon his arrival. Despite her humble upbringing and the hardships she endured, Mary was among the chosen girls. This news brought tension to Mary's household. Grace became cold and distant toward Mary, fearing that Mary might be favored by the prince. The atmosphere at home grew increasingly strained. Ruth, emboldened by her mother's attitude, began openly mocking Mary. She ridiculed Mary's simple clothes and the hard life she led. Mrs. Benson, ever watchful, noticed the change in Grace and Ruth's behavior. One day, upon returning from the village market, Mrs. Benson decided to address the issue. "Grace, Ruth," she began, her tone filled with concern, "I see how you treat Mary. She's just a young girl who has experienced so much pain. It's unfair to burden her with work meant for someone older and to treat her poorly." Grace narrowed her eyes and pursed her lips. "What happens in our home is none of your concern, Mrs. Benson," she replied sharply. "Mary needs to know her place. Ruth is my daughter, and I'll do whatever is best for her future." Bolstered by her mother's words, Ruth turned to Mary with a smirk. "Do you really think you can impress the prince, Mary?" she sneered. With those old clothes and your hands rough from hard work. Keep dreaming, stepsister. Mary remained silent, but each hurtful remark pierced her deeply. She felt like the unwanted stepdaughter, constantly given chores and overlooked when it came to her hopes and dreams. Finally, the day of David's return arrived. The village was bathed in golden sunlight as people gathered at the palace gates, eagerly awaiting the prince's arrival. Excited to meet their prince, the villagers gathered at the palace gates, where David greeted them with a warm smile. His eyes sparkled with curiosity as he observed the maidens chosen to meet him. Mr. Okoro, carrying himself with the dignity befitting his role, introduced each maiden: Tongue, Grace, Blessing, Favor, Mary, Ruth, and Ochi. Standing before the prince, their hearts raced with a mix of excitement and nervousness. Although born into royalty, David possessed a humility that endeared him to the villagers. He engaged each maiden in conversation, asking about their lives in the village and their aspirations for the future. Despite her own doubts, Mary met David's gaze sincerely, speaking of her love for the village and its people. She shared her dream to one day make a meaningful difference in the lives of the less fortunate. David found himself captivated by Mary's humility and inner strength, noticing the way she carried herself with grace. As the days passed, David took the time to learn more about each girl. He observed their interactions with the palace staff, their behavior at elaborate dinners, and the way they treated one another. Ruth, eager to impress him, adorned herself in the finest gowns and jewelry, showering David with flattery and charming smiles in her quest to win his favor. However, when away from the prince's gaze, Ruth's behavior toward the palace guards and other servants grew increasingly harsh and unpleasant. One evening, while strolling through the palace gardens disguised as a guard, David overheard Ruth berating a kitchen servant for a trivial mistake. Her tone was cutting and cruel, as she harshly criticized the servant's competence. Hidden from view, David listened with a heavy heart, troubled by the unkindness he witnessed. He realized that the qualities of a future queen, compassion, kindness, and humility, were sorely lacking in Ruth. Meanwhile, Mary quietly went about her tasks, treating everyone she encountered with respect and dignity. She assisted the kitchen staff with preparing meals, cared for the palace gardens, and listened attentively to the stories shared by the elderly servants who had faithfully served the royal family for generations. One day, while carrying a basket of freshly harvested vegetables intended for the evening meal, Mary accidentally bumped into David, who was disguised as a gardener. Startled, she dropped the basket, and the vegetables scattered across the ground. "I'm so sorry, sir," Mary stammered, her cheeks flushing with embarrassment. "I didn't see you there." David knelt down with a kind smile, helping her gather the fallen vegetables. "It's all right, Mary," he replied gently. "These vegetables may be soft, but they are nourishing, just like the kindness you show to others." As the days turned into weeks, the atmosphere within the palace grew tense. Ruth became increasingly bold in her attempts to capture the prince's attention, while Mary remained devoted to her duties. Mary often thought of Mrs. Benson and the simple joys of life back in the village, which provided her comfort amid the palace's growing drama. One evening, during a grand dinner hosted to officially welcome David back, Ruth stood before the assembled guests, ready to make a declaration. Her voice rang confidently across the hall. "My prince," Ruth began, her gaze fixed on David, "I have admired you from afar, dreaming of the day we would stand together as king and queen of this kingdom. I pledge my loyalty to you now and always," Ruth declared boldly, her voice commanding the attention of everyone in the grand hall. The crowd murmured in approval, their admiration evident as they beheld Ruth in her stunning gown of shimmering silk adorned with pearls. She stood radiant, an image of beauty and confidence. David felt taken aback by her sudden proclamation, though he maintained his composure, offering her a polite smile. "Thank you, Ruth, for your kind words," he replied courteously, his tone measured. From her seat in the shadows, Mary observed the scene with uncertainty swelling in her heart. She knew she could never rival Ruth's beauty, charisma, or charm. Yet, deep inside, Mary held no desire to compete. Her aspirations remained simple. She longed for a life of purpose and meaning, surrounded by people she cherished. Later that evening, after the festivities had ended, Mary retreated to her chamber. Alone with her thoughts, she gazed through the window at the moonlit gardens below. The soft glow reminded her of gentler times, the warmth of her mother's embrace, her father's loving smiles, and the simplicity of their life together before everything changed. A sudden knock at her door interrupted her reverie. She turned, startled, and hesitated before opening the door. To her astonishment, David stood there, his expression both solemn and kind. "Mary," he said, his voice soft as he spoke her name. "May I come in?" Speechless, Mary nodded, her heart pounding. She had never been alone with the prince before, and now, as he stood before her, a flutter of anticipation surged within her. As David entered, he searched her gaze, his own filled with quiet intensity. "I've been observing you," he began, his tone sincere. "These past weeks, I've watched how you carry yourself, with grace and humility. You possess a strength of character that is both rare and remarkable." Mary's cheeks flushed at his words, warmth filling her chest. "Thank you, Your Highness," she replied softly, her voice tinged with awe. "That means more to me than you know." David smiled, a gentle expression that seemed to ease Mary's anxious heart. "I have made my decision," he said, his tone steady, yet tinged with emotion. "But first, I must confess something to you." He revealed the truth of his disguise, explaining how he had taken on the role of a humble palace guard to observe the maidens without the influence of his royal identity. He spoke of how her kindness, resilience, and quiet strength had deeply touched his heart, in ways he had never anticipated. Mary listened in stunned disbelief, her mind reeling. Could it be true? Could the prince truly see something special in her, despite her plainness and humble life? David continued, his voice unwavering with conviction. "Mary, I choose you to be my queen. Not for your beauty, nor for your social standing, but for the compassion and kindness you have shown to others, qualities that define true royalty." Tears brimmed in Mary's eyes as the weight of his words settled upon her. "I am honored, Your Highness," she whispered, her voice scarcely above a breath. "But what of Ruth? She has declared her love for you before everyone." David sighed, his expression reflecting both resolve and sadness. "Ruth's affection for me is genuine, I have no doubt," he admitted. "But her treatment of others reveals a side of her heart that concerns me. A future queen must embody empathy and kindness, virtues that, unfortunately, seem absent in Ruth's actions." Mary nodded slowly, her heart heavy with compassion for her stepsister. Though Ruth had been cruel, Mary could not help but feel sorrow for her plight. "I understand, Your Highness," Mary replied softly, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I pray that Ruth finds happiness and fulfillment in her own way." David smiled, his gaze warm and filled with gratitude. "You are wise beyond your years, Mary," he said, his voice tinged with admiration. "With you by my side, I am certain that together we will bring joy, prosperity, and hope to our people." And so, Mary, the once lonely and hardworking orphan girl, became the queen of the village. She and David were married in a grand and splendid ceremony, a celebration unlike any the village had ever seen. Villagers from far and wide gathered to witness the union of their kind-hearted prince and the humble girl whose heart radiated compassion. The air was filled with music, laughter, and the fragrance of blooming flowers, as the kingdom rejoiced in this moment of unity and joy. Grace and Ruth attended the wedding as well, their hearts weighed down with guilt and regret for the unkindness they had shown Mary in the past. Watching her rise to this moment of honor and happiness, they could not help but reflect on their own actions. In the days that followed, they sought forgiveness from their neighbors and pledged to mend their ways. Grace softened with time, and Ruth, humbled by life's lessons, began to see the value of treating others with kindness. As for Mary, she never forgot the trials she endured and the lessons she learned through hardship and sorrow. She ruled alongside David with grace, wisdom, and unwavering compassion, becoming a queen who truly understood the struggles of her people. Her reign brought peace and prosperity to the kingdom, as she touched the lives of all who crossed her path with her kindness. In her quieter moments, Mary often thought of Mrs. Benson, the kind-hearted widow who had stood by her side when the world seemed cold and unkind. Mary honored her by ensuring the elderly and lonely of the kingdom were cared for, a legacy of love inspired by Mrs. Benson's unwavering belief in her. And so, the village flourished under the reign of Queen Mary and King David, their love for each other and their people enduring through the passage of time. Together, they built a legacy of hope, compassion, and unity, a testament to the strength of a kind and humble heart. If you find this story interesting, please like this video, and subscribe to Nigerian TV for more interesting stories like this one. Bye for now, and see you in the next one.